Hello, everyone. I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm excited to share my capstone project with you. I unfortunately don't own a webcam, so I apologize for speaking as a disembodied voice during this presentation. But for my project, I am undertaking an ecofeminist reading of J.R.R. Tolkien's of Beren and Luthien, which is one of the stories from the Silmarillion. After rereading this story in each portion of our course with the various elements of narrative theory in mind, I found that the concepts of space, narration, and focalization bear the most potential to contribute towards a better understanding of this text. Specifically, these concepts of narrative theory aid in an analysis that focuses upon the secondary perspectives of the story: Luthien, the story's heroine, and Huan, a hound that plays a significant role in the plot. Not to get too ahead of ourselves, though, I feel that a brief synopsis of the plot and description of the characters is in order. So, let's begin with the characters. Luthien is the tale's heroine. She is an elf born of nobility who falls in love with Beren upon their first meeting. As the story's most prominent female character, a feminist understanding of the text relies heavily upon her perspective. Beren is a human warrior who stumbles upon the kingdom of Luthien's father. After he falls in love with Luthien, he goes on a quest to win her father's approval for their marriage. Most of the story is focalized through him. Morgoth is the big bad guy in Tolkien's story world. Beren's quest is centered around stealing a jewel from Morgoth, so he plays a pretty important antagonistic role in the narrative. Finally, Huan is a warhound who abandons his masters to help Luthien in her part of the quest. As the story's principal non-human character, Huan's perspective is important for developing an ecological understanding of the narrative. There are lots of other minor characters in the story, but these main characters are the ones that my analysis relies most heavily upon. Now, I've written out a somewhat detailed synopsis of the story here. If you're interested, feel free to pause the presentation and read the whole thing, but if not, suffice to say that Beren and Luthien embark on a quest to steal a jewel from Morgoth. They succeed in this quest at the cost of Beren's life, but Luthien succeeds in bringing him back from the land of the dead, and the two embrace the fate of mortal mankind together. So, with this cursory knowledge of the plot and characters established, I'd like to move on to my analysis of the narrative. The following is my abstract. In this project, I will address feminist and ecological concerns in J.R.R. Tolkien's of Beren and Luthien through the narrative concepts of focalization, narration, and space. Ultimately, this project aims to establish the existence of patriarchal and ecologically exploitive forces in Tolkien's writing, explore the nature of those forces through the characters Luthien and Huan, and engage with the wider dialogue of ecological and feminist literary criticism. After establishing patriarchy as a feature of Tolkien's story world by examining Beren's actions early in the narrative, I will shift focus to Huan's speech and Luthien's encounters with male antagonists in order to demonstrate how the characters function within the hierarchy of the story world. In this way, I hope to develop an effective ecofeminist reading of Beren and Luthien that both improves scholarly understanding of Tolkien's work and contributes to modern ecological and feminist dialogues. My analysis begins with an exploration of Beren's flight from Darthonion, a natural paradise that has become corrupt, to Doriath, a hidden elven kingdom. In his escape from Darthonion, Beren climbs a mountain and discovers Doriath from above. This sequence of actions fits well within Mary Louise Pratt's definitions of, quote, colonial rediscovery, unquote, and, quote, master of all I survey scenes, unquote. The thinking here is that the discovery of remote, unknown regions that have really already been discovered, and the survey of new conquered or conquerable landscapes constitute two tropes in colonial literature. After drawing this connection between of Beren and Luthien and trends in colonial narrative, I expand that connection to establish the existence of patriarchal and ecologically exploitative forces in the story world. After establishing the existence of these forces, I'm interested in determining how the female and non-human characters of the story react to them. The first moment of interest for this task arises at Beren and Luthien's first meeting in Doriath. The narrative concept of focalization plays an important role in this analysis because Beren watches Luthien for some time before confronting her. Here, a discussion of male gaze in Of Beren and Luthien begins. In this instance, male gaze is, in and of itself, seemingly harmless, though one should note that Luthien's voice is limited or altogether repressed as a result of her distance from Beren. Because Beren acts as the primary focalizer in this scene, we don't hear any of what Luthien is saying or expressing, and we don't experience any of her thoughts or emotions. Also, it is helpful to note that the natural environment acts as an otherworldly sanctuary in this scene, a place where the horrors and politics of the outside world are powerless. Now, none of these observations are especially useful in and of themselves, but all of them prove necessary to establish a baseline that will allow for tracing the issues of male gaze, female voice, and human interaction with the environment throughout the story. So, out of the three narrative threads that I've just established, feminine voice, male gaze, and relationships between the characters and ecology of the story world, I'd like to explore ecology first by discussing Luthien's relationship to the land. For this purpose, several episodes in the narrative provide good material for analysis. I've already mentioned Luthien's initial meeting with Beren, wherein she is portrayed dancing and singing in the forest of Doriath. This idyllic scene establishes the forest as a nurturing, powerful, almost mythical environment to which Luthien and Beren have unique access. This relationship is further established in the story's first intermission, after Luthien breaks Beren out of prison and the two of them return to Doriath. In this scene, the two wander in the tranquil woods just as Luthien had before their meeting, and she professes that she would be, quote, content to wander, unquote, in the woods without completing the quest. From this profession, it becomes clear that both characters could exist in the woods indefinitely, in a near utopian environment where the threats of war and politics cannot penetrate. Another fascinating display of Luthien's relationship to the natural environment occurs when Beren leaves her for the battle that ends with his death. In this scene, quote, a shadow fell upon Luthien, and it seemed to her that the sun had sickened and turned to black, unquote. Here, we see how the ecology of Tolkien's story world not only serves as a sanctuary for Luthien, but also responds to her sentiment. Though this observation may make it seem as if Luthien and nature are interchangeable in A Beren and Luthien, this is not so. Rather, space serves as an instrument by which Luthien establishes and re-establishes her agency throughout the narrative. Notably, Luthien expresses a great degree of power when she tears down Sauron's fortress through the power of her voice. I will discuss this further in the section that deals specifically with voice, but suffice to say for now that space is an instrument by which Luthien achieves and re-demonstrates her agency. Now, on that note of Luthien's exertion of vocal power at Sauron's fortress, I also think that a discussion of Luthien's voice throughout the narrative is warranted. This portion of my analysis brings in some of the concepts that we discussed in our unit about narration. I concern myself especially with whose voices the narrator privileges throughout of Beren and Luthien, especially as that privilege pertains to songs in the narrative. In Of Beren and Luthien, there are 5 songs. Luthien sings 2, while Beren, his companion Finrod, and Morgoth's lieutenant Sauron each sing 1. These songs serve as a fascinating basis for narrative comparison because each is narrated slightly differently. The Song of Beren, the story's primary vocalizer, is narrated verbatim. We actually get every single lyric of the song on the page. The songs of Sauron and Finrod are wrapped up together and expressed as a single poem, with details from each song present in the narration, but without the narrator providing the lyrics of either songs verbatim. Notably, neither of Luthien's songs are related with anywhere near the same detail of the former 3. Rather, the narrator describes the first only as, quote, a heart-piercing song that released the bonds of winter, unquote, and, quote, a song of power, unquote, respectively, even though each of these songs has a great significance to the plot and to our image of Luthien as a character. In this way, the narrator of Beren and Luthien privileges male voice over female voice. With that said, Luthien's voice still appears as an instrument by which the character secures agency and resolves the failings of her male counterparts. For example, the Song of Power that Luthien uses to destroy Sauron's fortress prevents Beren's death and ends his torture. Furthermore, Luthien acts as a voice of reason at several points throughout the story, laying Beren's options out for him and prompting him with choices throughout the adventure. In this way, Luthien's voice is not entirely silenced by the story's narration, but we do see that the narrator privileges male characters as focalizers over female characters. After analyzing Luthien's character through a discussion of voice in the narrative, I move on to trace the thread of male gaze in Of Beren and Luthien. For this portion of the analysis, the narrative concept of focalization proves crucial. Specifically, I'm very interested in the portions of the story focalized through male characters in which Luthien is the subject. As I mentioned earlier, the first episode of interest that fits this description is the first meeting between Beren and Luthien. Since I already discussed this briefly, I'd like to move on to Luthien's confrontation with Morgoth. In this portion of the story, which takes place in Morgoth's hall, Luthien approaches in disguise, but Morgoth's gaze strips her of the disguise and reveals her identity. The narrator describes Morgoth's gaze as characterized by, quote, evil lust, unquote, and provocative of, quote, a design more dark than any that had yet come into his heart since he fled from Valinor, unquote. In response to this threat, Luthien remains undaunted and sings a song of power that blinds Morgoth and puts his court to sleep. As a direct result of Luthien's response to Morgoth's gaze, she and Beren are able to finally steal the Silmaril, or jewel, from Morgoth's crown. These two episodes serve as a good basis for understanding male gaze in Of Beren and Luthien. Like narration, focalization is a bit of a double-edged sword in the narrative. At one point, it serves to rob Luthien of her agency, and at another, it serves as the very instrument by which she exerts her power. In addition to this exploration of male gaze in relation to Luthien, I also identify the passages in the story that are focalized through Luthien. Now, these passages are few and far between, and they allow the readers very little access to Luthien's mindsets and emotions. Still, they are valuable in contrast to the majority of the passages which are focalized through male characters. Now, Luthien isn't the only character that I'm interested in as a secondary focalizer. Huan, as the story's primary non-human character, plays an important role in relation to the ecology of Tolkien's story world. Though the narrator focalizes much of the story through Beren, several brief passages are focalized through Huan, a hound who belongs to two elven nobles. In the first of these, the narrator says that Huan, quote, felt that evil had come to Nargothrond, unquote, and, quote, understood all that was said, unquote, in the stories that Luthien relates to him. Right off the bat, the narrator gives more access to the thoughts of Huan the Hound than they gave to Luthien's. The lens of focalization is clearer through Huan than it is through the story's chief female character. In another passage, the narrator states that Huan becomes, quote, impatient and desires to look upon the wolf, unquote, that he is hunting with the rest of the group. For the remainder of the hunt, Huan serves as the story's focalizer. From this brief survey of Huan's role in Of Beren and Luthien, it becomes clear that the hound possesses greater emotional transparency and therefore greater dimension and agency than Luthien. Huan's role as focalizer proves interesting not only because it stands in stark contrast to the text's limited vocalization through Luthien, but also because it highlights the significance of non-human animals in the narrative. Throughout the text, non-human characters express agency to the same degree that the human characters do. Thorondr the eagle, Charkaroth the wolf, and Thuringwethel the bat are three other non-human characters that serve significant roles in the story. The overall significance of non-human characters in the story firmly establishes the value of these entities in the ecology of Tolkien's story world, and provides critics with several windows through which we might better understand the role of the natural world in Tolkien's work. At the end of this exploration of secondary perspectives in Of Beren and Luthien, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Luthien and Huan remain subject to the same patriarchal and ecological forces of dominion, and are thus relegated to roles of secondary focalizers in the text. As I understand it, this common suffering serves as the foundation of ecofeminist critical thought. And with that in mind, I hope that you'll all keep Of Beren and Luthien, and perhaps Tolkien's work more broadly, in mind when you consider contemporary ecofeminist literature in your futures as readers, writers, and critics. Last of all, here are my scholarly sources if you'd like to take a closer look. All of these sources serve important roles in my analysis, but I didn't have time to go over all of them in the presentation. Please feel free to reach out and provide me with feedback via the comment section of this video or over email. Thank you.